Today in the EU, how close is Ukraine to joining the Union? Diplomats are on a race against time to start negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the Union before Hungary takes over the European Council's presidency. The country, with close ties to Russia, might try to kill the deal for good otherwise. Will EU member states succeed? Hello and welcome. I'm Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU.
We have set up 7 preconditions, and even by the evaluation of the Commission, 3 out of the 7 is not fulfilled. So there is no reason to negotiate membership of Ukraine now, even not to negotiate.
The views of Viktor Orban have definitely softened since December 2023. Hungary has indeed opened the door to diplomatic talks about Ukraine becoming the 28th member of the European Union. To discuss how much Orban is willing to concede and the scenarios ahead, I sat down with Euractiv's Global Europe's editor, Alexandra Brzozowski. Alex, EU leaders gave green light to Ukraine and Moldova's accession talks in December. You've been closely following the updates ever since. At what stage are negotiations today?
Indeed. So it has been 6 months now since EU leaders gave their political green light to the start of accession talks with Ukraine and Moldova. But that came also, we remember, after that famous gimmick we had with Hungary's Prime Minister Orban, who left the room for a coffee break, and then it could be agreed on EU 26 level.
Someone did not have to leave the room, but wanted to leave the room.
German Chancellor Scholz in December 2023 suggested to Viktor Orban to take a coffee break so that the 26 remaining leaders could vote unanimously in favor of opening Ukraine accession talks in his absence. Where are we now?
So now member states have been locked into discussions on the Commission's draft framework for negotiations. And this is with the hindsight of actually starting the formal accession talks in the end of June, maybe.
Because we have been hearing about accession talks, but formally they haven't started. How does the process work?
So the EU's accession process normally consists of 4 steps, which all require also unanimous approval by EU member states. So in December, the first step was made with the decision to open the talks, the political decision.
The European Council took the decision to grant enlargement steps forward, and this will be a landmark in our common history.
And since then, the European Commission has been coming up with this negotiation framework for the talks. So they presented that in March. And this is for Ukraine to prepare, implement the EU legislation. So in parallel to that framework that they presented, the EU has been conducting a screening process, which is essentially meant to assess which laws those 2 countries need to align to the EU legislation that is currently there. It's an evolving framework, obviously on the EU side, but the so-called acquis, which spell out in 33 to 35 chapters which policy fields they need to align.
What is the average timeline for the process?
Here you can really imagine the technical experts and negotiating teams sitting in a room from both sides and going through slides and slides of those presentations. And normally this takes quite a while. So normally it takes 1 to 2 years in the past. EU officials have said that they believe it could be done in 6 to 9 months in the case of Ukraine and Moldova. So according to the diplomats we have spoken to, the hope is that it could be completed before the Hungarian presidency, so that would be before July, or at least maybe in the second half of this year, which would also avoid that it becomes too politicized when Hungary raises potential issues about it. And at the same time, the screening process can also be carried out in parallel to the actual formal start of accession talks, which would be something that is called an intergovernmental conference. So you have the EU and the Ukrainian side coming and formally starting the talks after EU member states agree to exactly that framework that they will need for the negotiations afterwards. So that's where we are at the moment. And the talks afterwards, obviously, as we know, can take years.
Right. As you were mentioning, there has been pressure to accelerate the move before Hungary takes the presidency. Most countries out of the 27 member states are in favor of Ukraine joining the EU. And yet Hungary remains holding out its approval. What do you think it will take to change Budapest's sentiment?
Absolutely. Actually, that's the key question, because EU member states have discussed those negotiation frameworks now for weeks. And they were really unable to have a consensus on approving them, mostly because some member states have raised some reservations of how the text is phrased in certain points. But the Belgian presidency has been pushing for that discussion on the EU level with ambassadors, which were meant to clarify where the stumbling blocks are. And this happened essentially this week. But where some member states had reservations, I think most of that, as we understand, has been resolved. But that means that roughly 26 member states are in favor of holding that intergovernmental conference in the end of June. The date is, I think, the 25th of June at the moment, which is discussed, which would be EU affairs ministers coming to Brussels to launch them. But the reservations now are mostly coming from Hungary, which has requested changes to the text and has raised 11 bilateral issues, as we understand, which relate to either minority rights, trade, corruption, agriculture, internal market, or even just good neighborly relations. And we're actually in a very tricky situation.
How come?
Because member states are frustrated with Hungary and all those demands that are coming from Budapest now, because normally these things are solved within the formal accession talks over the years.
Right.
So it's not something that you solve beforehand. And in the end, that's why you have the accession talks, because then you can negotiate on a technical and political level how to solve those issues in a mutual legal way. So they're a bit frustrated that this is all demanded to be solved beforehand and not with the regular process.
And one sensitive issue that has been slowing down diplomatic talks is the question of the protection of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. Could you explain what the issue exactly revolves around?
So that's actually a very interesting issue and talking point of the Hungarian side. Hungary has a significant minority in Ukraine, especially around the Transcarpathia region, which is roughly 75,000 ethnic Hungarians. The Hungarian government has been providing financial support to them. They have wanted to keep the Hungarian identity alive, the connection to Budapest, which is usually a normal thing that countries do inside Europe and how they deal with their minorities in other countries. It has also simplified the procedure for acquiring Hungarian citizenship. So that's actually something that Ukraine really does not recognize. They don't recognize dual citizenship at the moment or oppose it. And now Prime Minister Viktor Orban has long alleged that Ukraine's government is infringing on those rights, also with regards to speaking their native language or dealing with simple public administration issues. So for Ukraine, it's a wider issue about, their efforts to boost national identity after Russia already invaded them the first time in 2014. And you had all these passportization issues in the East, especially also in the annexed Crimean Peninsula and elsewhere. So while this issue has been really used as an argument by Budapest for years now to block anything EU-related to Ukraine. I mean, we saw the funding issue earlier this year. We saw military support over the last 2 years, but also inside NATO for certain issues. Over those years, there have been actually quite some adjustments made already when it comes to the Ukrainian side. So,
what concrete measures has the Ukrainian government taken to reach a compromise with Viktor Orban's demands?
They have been improving the legislation and already improved some conditions that the Hungarians were raising. So in December, for example, Ukraine amended its education and language laws to comply with the EU laws and restored also some of the language rights that were demanded by Budapest. And on the other side, those legal changes also restored the rights of students studying in their native language, which actually by most ethnic Hungarians in that area has been viewed as a positive step. So it's not like there has been no change made. I think the Ukrainians moved quite a lot. But in the end, the question is that just an argument that is used for the sake of using the argument against accession talks?
You're saying that Hungary is using their concerns as diplomatic leverage and that they could have waited for the accession talks. But why is that the case?
Because essentially, once you start the formal accession talks, the EU side and the Ukrainian side sit down and go chapter by policy chapter to discuss on the technical level how issues can be resolved and how legislation can be aligned. But for every opening of the chapter and closing of those chapters, you need unanimity as well. At the moment, there's thoughts to see how that maybe can be changed. I mean, there's an idea of maybe having chapters being opened by qualified majority and then having them closed still by unanimity, but that's still in the process. But effectively, what Hungary has is a veto right over every chapter, which, again, I think if you really want to make sure that your concerns are addressed, then that's to address in this process and not necessarily beforehand.
As you were saying, Ukraine has implemented different laws before the end of last year in the effort to speed up the process. But why now? Why is the pressure there?
So the EU and the two countries, Ukraine, Moldova, also want to launch those formal talks before the Hungarians take over the presidency on the 1st of July. Moldova is actually not so much an issue. As we understand, the Hungarians are fine with that. The problem is with Ukraine, but considering that they should move forward together and they're tied in some way in the process, that kind of holds up the other as well. But however, why now? I mean, yes, there is a bit of a concern that nothing might move in the next 6 months if the Hungarians take over the presidency. So if it doesn't happen until the 25th of June or around that week, it could be that both countries might lose time in what they could actually already achieve in those 6 months, right? They could already start aligning legislation, opening chapters maybe by next year and starting the really nitty-gritty legal talks. But essentially, the idea was to start it in June, and then maybe you can open some chapters of negotiations on different policy fields in January next year. But if that doesn't happen by June, and for now it's a bit unclear where the discussion will fall also next week, because EU ambassadors might revisit those discussions, it could be that, again, for the next 6 months, we're not really moving forward. And then the question is also about the lost momentum in the enlargement process.
The 25th of June as the final date to start negotiations is quite a tight deadline. It is in less than 30 days and just a few weeks after the European elections. How likely is it that these accession talks formally begin in time?
I think there's a good chance that things might move. Even if they might not move next week at EU ambassadors level, it could be that the issue might be actually taken to the EU leaders level at the summit in June, if member states really believe that they want to push before the 1st of July.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractivist to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.